Hello, welcome to the second Building Resilience for Health webinar hosted by Chemical Insights Research Institute of UL Research Institutes. Today's session will focus on understanding wildfires in the wildland to urban interface, the built environment, and public health. My name is Mark Wilson, and I'll be moderating the webinar for today. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time through the Q&A section. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible. And if your question is posted for a specific panelist, please include that information with your question. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available to all registered participants after the session has ended. With that said, let's get started. So joining us today as our presenters are Brian Metzger, who is a fire protection engineer from the National Fire and Emergency Medical Services Program Division of the United States Fire Administration. Chuck Mikolas, who is a managing director of commercial lines and building resiliency expert with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. Annette Stelmack, who is a sustainable designer and founding principal consultant from InSpirit Consulting. Dr. Christopher Weiss, who is the science director and principal consultant for Weiss Toxicology. And myself, Mark Wilson, who is the Director for Exposure Science here at Chemical Insights Research Institutes. So during our first webinar, which was entitled Protecting Human Health While Adapting to Extreme Climate Conditions, we examined what it means to support human health in the face of the many environmental stressors that are associated with climate change. These include extreme heat, precipitation events, and large-scale wildfires. We began by sharing the map you see on your screen, which shows weather and climate-related disasters which have occurred over the past 5 years that have each exceeded over $1 billion in financial losses. So we like to start off this webinar with this same visual to consistently communicate that we have a very wide variety of climate-related challenges to solve, and that this is a nationwide and realistically even a global issue. So today, when we consider resilient strategies in the face of climate change as they relate to extreme weather events, our efforts primarily focus on things like renewable energy, tightening the building envelope, which has impacts on energy efficiency, use of energy efficient systems, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But the goal of this webinar series is to help us expand our definition of what it means to be resilient in the face of climate change and our approach to addressing it. So expanding this goal requires incorporating design measures that strive to make our buildings more resilient to projected impacts associated with the changing climate, and most importantly, to strive to make decisions that are supportive of human health outcomes. Our focus for this webinar today is specifically on wildfires and fires that occur at the wildland urban interface, or WUI fires. And so while we might think of wildfires as just another type of environmental or natural disaster, there is something that is very unique about them in that they are the only disaster that humans can both start and stop. So with that said, I will turn it over to Brian Metzger.
All right, thanks, Mark. My name again is Brian Metzger. I'm a fire protection engineer with the U.S. Fire Administration. If you're not familiar, we are part of FEMA, housed within the Department of Homeland Security, and we are tasked with supporting and strengthening the fire and emergency medical services and stakeholders in the U.S. to prepare for mitigate, prevent, respond to all hazards. Fire being one of those hazards. Fire, just as a point of reference, kills more people in America every year than all natural disasters combined. That's primarily structure fires, but wildfires are also a part of that. And as you can see from this graphic, if you were to try and envision sort of how that's been going, this is a graphic from NOAA that tracks sort of billion-dollar disasters, and this isn't a vision test. It's just sort of give you an idea to see how the trend is going here. And you'll notice that the billion-dollar wildfires are increasing. They're becoming more frequent, more expensive as time goes on. So it kind of frames the issue and how the growing nature of this particular phenomena. Next slide, please. Aside from just sort of straight dollar losses, like there's different ways of envisioning sort of what the costs of wildfire events are. And here's a few sources from the EPA, NIST, and I believe that's National Bureau of Economic Research is that bottom one there. There's a lot of costs associated with it. In addition to lives lost, there's socioeconomic, long-lived economic impacts from wildfire events. Next slide. Part of why the costs are increasing, besides just the increase in frequency of the actual sort of phenomena, there's a number of reasons why the challenge is growing, right? We have climate change is playing a role. We have impacts from that alone that sort of contribute to the increase in wildfire frequency. But we also have sort of the result of policy decisions, longstanding policy decisions in some cases, as well as just more people living in areas that are susceptible or prone to these types of events. Next slide. For envisioning where the wildland urban interface is kind of the key term here. There are, let me frame it a little bit. There's sort of wildland, and there's cities, and there's urban areas, suburban areas. The wildland urban interface is essentially where the built environment, human activity interfaces with wildlands. So the graphic kind of gives you an idea of what that can look like, but sometimes it's a little more intermixed, where you have homes and structures that are kind of more out in the woods, so to speak, or it can include the location of infrastructure, for instance, where power lines exist or other critical infrastructure. Next slide. So the previous slide I showed sort of the what it looks like, kind of what the definition is, to give you a sense for how large that is in the U.S. We have roughly this number. My understanding is this number is actually, like I said, it's growing, and the number is really more like 70,000 communities at this point that qualify or could be considered to be in the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, and part of what complicates the hazard is that the factors are growing, right? We have more frequent incidents. We have more people exposed to them. We have parts of the country that used to deal with wildfire activity on sort of a seasonal basis. Well, in some cases that either the seasons are longer, or we're now in a period where the so-called fire season could go the whole year. And obviously that's a serious challenge. It's very difficult to manage and respond to. We also have, I want to make sure part of our mission here at the U.S. Fire Administration, for instance, is to dispel the idea that maybe wildfire is just unique to some, like that's a West Coast problem or a particular state's problem. But in fact, the hazard itself, wildfires can happen basically anywhere in the U.S. And some of our worst WUI fires in particular have occurred in places that are not typically associated with wildfire activity. Most notably and most recently, the wildfires in Lahaina and Maui. Tennessee, several years ago in the Gatlinburg fires, there was a major wildfire there. And then historically, there's been fires in Maine, Wisconsin. Perhaps one of the largest was at the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin back in 1871, which coincidentally happened on the same day as the Great Chicago Fire. A lot of people have heard the lore of the Great Chicago Fire, and probably haven't heard as much about the Peshtigo Fire, but it was in fact a very large wildfire, WUI fire, and like I said, the hazard itself is throughout the U.S. So we want to make sure that people are thinking about the hazard before they actually have one in their community, and that requires them to think in terms of this location aspect. The hazard is mapped. Several organizations have tried to sort of map and show what we mean when we say wildfire hazard. So they'll have wildfire hazard potential mapping. This one, for instance, is from the USDA and the Forest Service. It gives you a sense of sort of where the hazard exists and maybe how it varies based on different metrics or factors. Next slide. And there's another attempt. This is the Climber tool produced by Argonne National Labs. And it again tries to show sort of what the hazard looks like. Now, in a lot of cases, these hazards are showing sort of conditions on the ground that would contribute to how receptive the fuels on the ground are to an ignition source, for instance. So if you had, say, a lightning strike or power line failure, these darker shaded areas are just very ignitable, and that probability of ignition varies over time or season. Next slide. Part of what I try to get people to think about is risk in terms of like math. Basically, it can be viewed as a mathematical equation, where risk is really the product of probability and consequence. And a lot of the maps that are out there are often showing what could be considered sort of a probability of spread given an ignition. And then each ignition source would have its own sort of probability associated with it. So depending on what kind of assessment you're trying to do, it's important to understand these concepts, because that probability alone, whether it's for the probability of spread or probability of ignition, it too varies over time and based on conditions or weather or climate. All these things factor in. And so, like I said, there's different ignition sources. For instance, lightning, power line failures, human activities, arson. We have fires that are started by vehicles that are off-road or accidents or trash burning. There's a whole bunch of stuff that can start a fire. And then the probabilities vary based on, different factors, whether it's the type of fuels, the weather, and that probability of all those factors varies really by the hour. And so, like, back to what I was saying about this not being sort of a Western only problem, we want people to be thinking about, well, if they had a month-long drought, for instance, and say you're on an East Coast community, you could still go from being maybe a relatively low risk area for wildfire to a high risk probability, depending on what your local conditions might be and how that can change by the hour or by the month, whatever it may be. And like I said, fuels, a lot of times, for wildfire, you'll see a lot of talk about shrubs and grasses and things like that. Those are sort of vegetative fuels. But fuels can also end up being things like structures, houses, vehicles, and like I said, power lines or different types of infrastructure, power plants, power, like battery banks and things like that. Next slide. So then once you're thinking in terms of probability and consequence for risk, there are also organizations. In this case, this is again the Forest Service. This is a snapshot from wildfirerisk.org. They are also trying to depict how risk might compare throughout the country based on different factors. And this is a tool that's on the web that you can get in and play with, and you put in an address and it'll try to give you an estimation of sort of what your risk might be. But just keep in mind that the risk has context, right? It might be probability or risk for vegetative fuels versus risk for structures. So you will want to be thinking about that. Next slide. So along those lines, what we did here at the USFA is we tried to produce some tools to help people understand where is the WUI in the US? What does it look like? How does that definition that I discussed earlier translate into your community, for instance. So what we're about to publish probably later this month is a set of tools. We're going to publish them to the FEMA Geospatial Resource Center. So these will be free, public facing, and available to anyone really to use. But the idea here is we want people to understand where the WUI is, what it looks like, or why you might be in the WUI or not. So these tools you put in this case, an address, and it pulls up some graphics here on the right side. That gauge cluster, for instance, basically tries to inform you about why that address you put in is considered in the WUI based on its proximity to vegetative fuels. It's the density of structures per acre and the proximity of structures to one another. And there's a whole bunch of data behind this tool, or it's actually two tools. But we took a land cover GIS layer, combined it with the FEMA USA structures layer, GIS layer, and then did some magic math basically to understand how close each of those structures, there's roughly 180 million structures that are contained in that data set. We determined how far away from each other those structures were, as well as how far away from those vegetative fuels those structures were, and put that together, and it kind of gives you an idea of where you fit in the WUI. Here's some of the graphics. There's another one where you put in basically a place like a county or a city, and it gives you this different levels of information. We also have some socioeconomic data laid into this tool. In this case, the Justice 40 layer, GIS layer. So that can be useful. The bubbles, the circles on the top right here are basically the number of structures that have additional structures less than 30 feet apart. So the idea is that, local AHJs, fire marshals, fire departments, community leaders, whoever may be, to try and give them the information and tools that they can use to either do targeted outreach or targeted mitigation campaigns, or even seek grant funding. We're trying to give them tools that will help them do that work or do those requests. It's a very heavy lift here, to the point where we've probably simplified it so much that you don't pick up on the fact that there's billions of data points hiding within this data. But it's, again, we're trying to get people to think ahead of a fire. These are all tools and decisions we want people to be thinking about or doing before they get a fire. If you're going to do mitigation work, you have to do that kind of before you get the fire. It can't always be an afterthought. And so we want people to do to be equipped to go out and do that kind of work. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Brian, and hello, everyone. My name is Chris Weiss. I'm director of Weiss Toxicology. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but you can find me on the web if you'd like. I want to talk to you a little bit about the toxicological consequences of fire. And as you can see from this picture, these things can be somewhat horrific. But what you see here, and what we'll be talking about over the next couple of minutes, is the fact that we both have a wood fire here and we have a structure fire. And that is problematic, and it's extremely different from from fighting a wildland fire or a structural fire. When you mix the two together, you have a different animal. Next slide, please. So that's because our houses are largely made out of plastic. When I look around my home, I see lots of structural plastic in my home, but I also see components and carpets and all types of different materials that are vulnerable to burning when there's a WUI fire. Those materials most of them are ignitable. They can be ignited by nearby woodland fires, and that's where the problem really gets complex from a toxicological point of view. Next slide, please. So here, an interesting photo, having my kids are out of the house now, but my home looked somewhat like this before they left. And there are lots of plastic toys, plastic materials, our synthetic clothing. Couches are often made out of materials that, when combusted, emit all kinds of highly complex vapors and smoke. So this is what makes these types of fires so complicated and so dangerous. Next slide, please. So again, these emissions include particle matter, simple particulate, smoke. We've all had that experience. But they also include volatile organic compounds, some of which behave very differently than wood smoke and can cause problems that are unique from simply breathing smoke. There are also semi-volatile organic compounds. So what we're working toward with this type of fire is these complex mixtures that can include not just wood smoke, but organic materials, chlorine, cyanates, etc. Next slide. So as we've learned over the past several years, and Brian has shown us the increasing number of fires in the United States, and in fact worldwide, is that the smoke and the plumes from these fires can reach tens of miles, hundreds of miles, and in some cases thousands of miles or more. These materials, the smoke from these fires, in fact, here I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, we were receiving smoke from fires in the Midwest and even further west, and also up in Canada last year. And these materials are not just wood smoke. They contain many complex mixtures of chemicals that are a result of the interface between wildland fires and structural fires. Next slide. So collectively, these things can affect very different organs in the body. They're also absorbed in very different ways. So obviously, the lung is a very important, very susceptible target to particulates and other poisons that might be associated with the combustion products from fires. But interestingly, you can also swallow this material as it gets caught in your lungs and gets coughed up and then swallowed. Importantly, many of these materials, particularly the organic compounds, can be absorbed across the skin. So these are all things that we're concerned about when we think about this type of fire, and especially, as Brian said, when we think ahead about how we're going to protect ourselves from this type of fire. Next slide. So particulate matter makes its way into the lung. The upper reaches of your lung there in the cartoon to the right, material can be moved from your upper respiratory tract into your esophagus, where you swallow it and it ends up in your digestive system. Importantly, the place deep in the lungs, the alveoli of the lung, where gas exchange takes place on every time we breathe, the oxygen in and waste products exhaled, are very, very susceptible. These are fragile. The physiology of the alveoli is extremely fragile, and it's in very close proximity to virtually everything we breathe. Next slide. So, as I've said, just to reiterate, you can be exposed to these materials by breathing them, by ingesting them, and by absorbing them across your skin. Next slide. And it's always important to remember that everyone's different. We have susceptible subpopulations who are far more affected by exposure to toxic materials than others. Children are particularly susceptible because there's the surface area of their skin versus their body weight is much higher than it is in an adult. Pregnant women, of course, are always of concern where a fetus is growing and developing, and exposure to chemicals can affect them in ways that adults are simply not affected. The elderly and the infirmed, folks that already have asthma, respiratory problems. Almost all of us know someone who has asthma or is very affected by exposure to inhaled particulates, and those folks are all very, very susceptible. Interestingly, firefighters who we really have two populations of firefighters out there, those who fight wildland fires and those who fight structural fires. And these folks use different types of protective gear, and we have a very strong interest in assuring that the gear that they use protects them. These are the folks that protect us and who get very close to these fires. Next slide. So one more thing I wanted to mention, that I'm a toxicologist. I live in that world, for better for worse. But I've been into many disasters, and I want to share the importance of preparing for these things. None of us are really completely psychologically prepared for what happens when there's a devastating fire or other disaster in our community. It's very difficult to figure out what's going on when your whole world is turned upside down. There are many things you can do to prepare yourselves and have an understanding of what can happen when a disaster rips through your community. And there are a lot of resources you can turn to prepare for these things, to protect yourselves during a disastrous event, and then to do important follow-up afterwards. One more slide, I think. So this slide is a little complicated, but I wanted to share this with you, and you're going to hear a little bit more about this. I'd like you to listen to Annette, who's up next, and her experience with wildland and urban interface fires, Wildfires. The contaminants that come off of these things, as we've just discussed, can be very complex mixtures of materials. Some of those materials are absorbed quickly. If you look at the red line here on toxin absorption, and they're eliminated from the body quickly. So within a few hours, the smoke's gone. You're no longer really worried about the smoke and the particulate. Other materials linger and are absorbed more slowly. So hours after the fire or the event, you can still be exposed. And remember, we're talking about inhalation exposure, ingestion, and dermal exposure. And then finally, even months or years after the fire, the toxicology can be problematic. So there's a very important lesson here regarding how to protect yourself and prepare for fires, understanding that once the flames are gone, that's not necessarily the end of the toxicological concerns associated with the fire. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Annette, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Chris. Hi, everyone. Annette Stelmack with Inspirit. I've been in the building industry for 45 plus years and a focus on sustainable, healthy interiors the last 25, with a focus on multiple chemical sensitivities and also healthy indoor air quality. So with that, we're going to watch a quick video.
Yes, sir. We do have a small fire. It's just south of Marshall Road on Highway 93. We're extinguishing it now. I'll get back to you here in a few minutes.
We
need to let folks know to the east of our incident that we now have fire on both sides, and it's pushing east fast. So if we can let all those folks know, probably within a couple miles east, that they need to start evacuating.
Come on, come on, come on.
Yeah, the fire is going to be moving, obviously, in a eastern direction. Fire's moving through the property, and it's going to be moving into some homes. I'm going to need additional units.
4631 and 2207. 4631 and 2207. Respond to 181 Mohawk Circle. 181 Mohawk Circle. I have a party trapped in their home due to the fire. 1232.
2619.
2619.
Emergency traffic. We're on Cherokee Avenue and Fox Lane. We have multiple houses on fire. We are backing out of here. We are in heavy fire, heavy fire.
Marshal Command.
I understand we have lots of structures burning, and just air, please, for me over the county fire channel.
This is our community.
All units to operate in a safe area. We don't want them to commit if they can't see and if it's too dangerous, and we're going to try to let the fire burn through and then pick it up on the backside. Also, if they need to move to a safe spot, just have them stage on a roadway, and then after the fire passes through, we'll go to work on suppression. This thing is just running. We probably have 100-mile-an-hour winds up here, and we can't get ahead of it.
So as you heard, the winds were over 100 miles per hour. This is our backyard and a street about 2 blocks away showing where the fire was igniting. We had extremely dry conditions, hadn't had any significant moisture for about 6 months. And this was the end of December. So we should have been having snow and such, but that just wasn't the case. At the time, our grandkids were visiting, and we actually had the table set for Christmas to celebrate a belated Christmas with our family. Our son called, who works for the neighboring town, and said they were evacuating. So we quickly packed up and we're on our way out. Next. Here you see the devastation. There were over 1,000 homes burned in the Louisville, Superior, and East Boulder County areas. We were immediately adjacent to, like literally within a block of the toxic burn of these neighborhoods. They were to the west of us, the south, and the north. And the way that the wind was blowing, all of this was coming into our house. And what we found out after the fact is that we, in fact, did have soot, char, ash, and rubber dust in our home. And our home was contaminated on the inside, as well as the outside, as well as the soil and the water. Next. So as it says here, you know, those of us who were blessed, and let me tell you, we were, it still gets me, incredibly blessed. Next slide. But we did quickly move on to figuring out what to do. So in fact, I was in there vacuuming the day that we left, and then when we came back, and I have learned so much from everybody on the panel. We had about 4 feet of soot that came into the home, and we did a great job of trying to clean up as much as we could, but definitely were surrounded by things that we shouldn't have been. We had initially had the indoor air quality tested out of pocket because we wanted to know. We did find that we had some fine particulates, both the 2.5 and the large PM10s. Fortunately, not much carbon dioxide or formaldehyde or TVOCs or hydrogen sulfide or carbon monoxide. So we were fortunate there, but we did have an awful lot of residual soot, as Chris talked about, that you end up with in a home. Fortunately, right before we left, I had the grandkids run around the house, turn on all the bathroom fans. We turned on the kitchen fan and any fan we could think of. And fortunately, our furnace, it was a whole house, it has an electronic cleaner on it with a MERV 13. So that helped. After the indoor air quality testing was done, we also did smoke testing, and that's where we found the residuals of the soot, the char, the ash, and the rubber dust. Next. So we went through a very thorough process for the mitigation of making sure that the company that we hired was the best one for us. So we really went through a self-advocation process. And if there's anything I want to get across, I think is that piece of it, because you do have the initial input from the insurance company, who ours was fantastic, coming in to tell you, you know, here's who you should use. And they kind of come in and do a one and done approach. We broke it down, and after having the testing done, knowing that the majority of the soot, char, and ash was on the west side of the home, inside of the home, we didn't necessarily need to be as detailed maybe everywhere. So we had them start first in the attic, where we had to replace the insulation because all of the debris that was up there. Did the attic work. From there, it was basically a top-down approach. So ceilings, walls, countertops, appliances, anything that was external was handled by the remediation company. From there, we did anything on the inside. So closets, interior cabinets, you know, going in and washing all the dishes, checking our pantry. Fortunately, those areas were closed off sufficiently that we didn't have a lot to deal with in there, but still went through that removal and cleaning. So we were very fortunate, as I mentioned, and I apologize for my emotion. This still gets me after all of these years that, you know, we were just so incredibly blessed. One of the things that I found, and the lessons learned, I think that is the other big takeaway, is as you're going through these inspections, make sure you also do a home inspection, because there could be residual heat building in and around the home that could later ignite. We were in good shape, and that was one of the first things that we had done. Our soft goods didn't smell, but we did find that after the fact, and as Chris mentioned, you know, there was a lot of stuff in there. So we came back a little too soon. Fortunately, we're both fine. Make sure that you self-advocate. Document your losses, work closely with your insurance company. As I mentioned, ours was incredibly supportive, and I think learned some things, you know, through this sort of healthy home environment approach that I was taking. And then go through and confirm that the mitigation path that you're taking really does meet your goals and your needs. And don't be afraid to ask the questions, ask the hard questions, ask, you know, what kind of cleaning products are you using? Why are you putting an ozonogenator in my home? I don't want ozone in my home, things of that nature, and make sure that you understand. And we took the time and the effort and the cost to hire the certified hygienist, the indoor air quality specialist, to make sure that all of that was handled. And in the end, had it retested so that if we ever sell our home, would be good. And then last, what you'll see here is our timeline. So it took us almost 7 months from start to finish to go through everything. And that was probably not ideal, but I wanted to make sure that we were doing it right. And ironically, the piece that took the longest was the garage, because it was directly exposed and obviously not as leak proof, and unfortunately a lot of stuff in there too. So as I said, thanks for having me. Incredibly blessed and so happy to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Annette. Very compelling story of what you went through, and I just wanted to give you a quick heads up on who we are. So the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety is an independent 501c3 nonprofit scientific research and communications organization that is supported by property insurers, reinsurers, and affiliated companies. And our building safety research leads to real-world solutions for home and business owners, helping to create more resilient communities. So having said that, let's talk a little bit on how can we bend down the wildfire risk. And as you all know, everyone knows that, you know, direct flame contact is a leading cause for fire spread, but there's also a couple of other ways, including radiative heat, which is basically when there's enough heat nearby that it generates enough heat that the material can ignite. And then there's embers. And embers really is the culprit for igniting up to 90% of homes that burn down in a wildfire. And these are the small embers that are go aloft up into the air and ignite additional fuels. So next slide. So since we know that wildfires start primarily from embers, IBHS generates embers in our research center to test various construction methods and techniques. I'm going to show you a little video here where we have two side-by-side structures. The one on the right is built with non-combustible materials, such as cement fiber siding, Class A fire-rated shingles, aluminum gutters, non-combustible zone around the house. And on the left, as you see it burn, has mulch around the building, and then it has wood siding and plastic gutters. And you can see how quickly the building can ignite when those embers gather at the base of an exterior wall like this. And this is very common scenario that you will see out in the real world. And this can lead to a complete and catastrophic loss. This goes right up the wall to the soffits. Okay, so our research findings helps deepen the industry's understanding of wildfire, and we generate a lot of resources to put science into action so homeowners can do something about their properties. Each component of a home is intertwined into its vulnerability and the vulnerability of a neighborhood, as you saw in Net's experience. So let's talk about some of the things you can do. Next slide, please. So we also, our research also helps develop building programs and certifications. We now have a wildfire prepared home voluntary designation program in California to meaningfully distinguish a property from unmitigated or partially mitigated properties. And then a wildfire prepared home plus is an elevated designation for extra actions that can be taken to help protect your home and surrounding area. Next slide. So some of the things that are related to a home typically would involve your roof. So you want to have a Class A fire rated roof system, and you want to choose non-combustible gutters and downspouts because they often will ignite. And you want to make sure that you always keep your roof and gutters clear of debris. So maintenance is always a good and important part of maintaining your home. And to improve your risk reduction, you can install covers over your gutters, which would help prevent the accumulation of leaves and pine needles and things like that. Next slide. And then some other general requirements is that you'd want to have ember and flame resistant vents so you don't get them coming into the to the building. And then as you see in the call out circled area, have a 6-inch vertical non-combustible clearance at the base of the wall. So in case that there are embers that accumulate along that part of the home, it won't ignite anything. You'll have a non-combustible clearance there. And then also, if you want to plus up, go for an entirely non-combustible siding. So you eliminate those combustibles and upgrade your windows and doors to get double pane windows, and also enclose those eaves in the under bays of windows. Next slide. And then also coupled with the desire for non-combustible construction, you want to have defensible space, and this is where you want to maintain a reduction in the ignition zones around your home. So within the 0 to 5 foot is also known as the home ignition zone, and you want to keep that clear of any combustible materials and always remove any kind of overhanging branches. You want to clean and maintain the under deck areas as well. If you have any decks or patios, you keep them cleared, and then also keep that yard clear of debris as well. Remove and replace any combustible fencing within 5 feet of the home. So if you've got a wood fence or a vinyl fence that's going up to your home, you do not want that continuity of combustibles to lead right to your home. Also then, for plus up requirements, move any outbuildings at least 30 feet away from the home. The further away, the better. Remove any back-to-back fencing, again, and then upgrade to a wildfire resistant deck as well. So these are just some of the few mitigating factors that you can incorporate. And then as you've heard previously too, always have a plan. Have a plan for your family, an evacuation plan. What are you going to do? Make sure you bring your important valuables and things of that nature. So having said all this, I'm going to now turn it over to Mark. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I want to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise and experiences with us, and to also remind all of our participants to continue to submit questions to the Q&A if you have them. We can move to the next slide. I want to touch on some of the research that we're doing here at CIRI as it relates to some of the unknowns we have that have been highlighted by our panelists. One of them in particular is dealing with the residue that is left after a fire has occurred. So as Annette pointed out, there was a whole lot of dust and soot that intruded into their indoor environment. And this is something that we're actively looking at as a toxicological exposure scenario in a post-fire situation. So we have developed methodology to collect settled dust using a inline vacuum filter, just fitted into a vacuum cleaner, that will allow us to collect settled dust in homes and outdoor spaces, as well as in laboratory settings, after fires have occurred. And we can take very small quantities of that dust, like milligram amounts, wrap it in quartz wool, which is what's shown in the picture in the center here, and put that quartz wool dust mixture into a thermal desorption tube and analyze it directly for volatile chemicals with GCMS analysis, thermal desorption GCMS analysis. And that allows us to look at potential indoor air quality impacts associated with this residue, but also, to Chris's point, gives us the ability to do risk modeling associated with additional routes of exposure. For instance, ingestion and dermal exposures to these materials. So we do have a technical brief strategic research initiative that highlights the development of this message or methodology available on our website. But this is part of a larger endeavor to understand the toxicological outcomes associated with what happens during a fire and after a fire has occurred. So next slide, please. So we are engaged in a collaborative assessment of emissions from WUI type fire scenarios with our partners at West Virginia University. And what we're doing in this project is we're developing wood pellets that are made of 4 regionally specific types of wood that represent biomass fuels in the Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, Northeast, Northwest, etc. And also mixing in various amounts of synthetic building materials within these pellets. So we have pellets that are consisting of 100% wood, pellets that consist of 75% wood and 25% oriented strand board, pellets that are 97% wood and 3% foam board insulation, pellets that are 83% wood and 17% vinyl flooring, and a group of pellets that are 55% wood and consist of all 3 of those synthetic materials. We are able to put those into a combustion apparatus that is able to control both airflow and combustion emissions, as well as fuel feed rates. And we can pull direct air samples out of the flue to measure direct emissions associated with what chemicals are being emitted when these materials are burned. And we can also collect the material that's left at the bottom, the ash, after the burn has been completed. So we can integrate those two data streams using our dust VOC evaluation methodology in tandem with traditional air sampling to get a more comprehensive picture associated with the total emission spectra associated with various combinations of biomass fuels as well as synthetic building materials. So next slide, please. So this just shows some preliminary results from our dust VOC methodology. And the column on the left is designating the various formulations of pellets. So they are in groups of 4, and those 4 represent the 4 regionally specific wood types. And the second column, levoglucosan, is something that we wanted to evaluate because it is a marker of biomass combustion. It's one of the things that you see associated with pyrolysis of starches and cellulosic material. So we saw that there was a higher concentration of levoglucosan in our 100% wood pellets compared to pellets that were formulated with various synthetic materials. The next column is styrene, and the FBI designation associated with the third group of 4 down on the list is designating foam board insulation. And this is polystyrene foam insulation. So we get a very good signal associated with styrene, the monomer, from combustion of foam board insulation in combination with biomass fuels. The third column is a pretty common impurity associated with polystyrene manufacturing. So seeing it kind of coexisting with styrene was something that we also kind of expected. And the group of 4 down at the very end is the 4 different types of regional woods mixed with all 3 synthetic materials at once. And we can see that the synthetic materials are represented within this mixture as well. The column all the way second to the right is something that was actually very interesting to see. So this is diethylhexyl terephthalate, which is a plasticizing agent. It was highly present in vinyl flooring. And this is a material that has been brought into the marketplace to replace some legacy phthalates that had more toxicity associated with them than would normally be acceptable. So this is a brand new material, but it does highlight that you do see plasticizing agents in the residual material following a fire, and that there is a strong possibility that in homes that have legacy products that still contain older materials, you would see a similar profile associated with the material that is left. It's also worth pointing out that the scale between those two is different by a factor of 10. This series of graphs is showing emissions from the actual fire. So what we see here are 4 different individual chemicals. Each graph has on the x-axis the different regionally specific woods, and the synthetic materials are represented by the color. So for vinyl acetate and benzofuran, there are not a lot of very apparent differences between just pure wood itself, but for things like ethylbenzene and styrene is a group 2A IARC carcinogen, we can see that there is a very clear difference between the emission profile during combustion associated with 100% wood and fiberboard insulation. fiberboard insulation is absolutely a very common building material. So next slide, please. So we intend to apply these methods that we've developed in a lab scale setting to our field work. We have two ongoing projects that are associated with the evaluation of community at risk for wildfire impact, which was in kind of mid-California. And this is in collaboration with the EPA, where we conducted indoor and outdoor air sampling to evaluate chemical and particle characterizations associated with ambient conditions. And another one is the second text box, Wildland Urban Interface Fires and Community Health in Maui, an evaluation of settled dust. And this is evaluating a community that was heavily impacted by a wildfire event. So we can move to the next slide, please. We're also engaged in research evaluation, in research that's evaluating mitigation strategies for exposures associated with wildfires. So one of those is an evaluation of do-it-yourself air filters, which are effectively made of duct tape, HVAC filter, and a box fan, in which we evaluated the safety of operating these devices in terms of their fire safety in general. We're also engaged in a collaborative project with Duke University and USC to evaluate the impact of air cleaner use on cardiometabolic health in high-risk individuals who are exposed to PM. So if we can move to the next slide. So, thank you. Our first question is from Bud Offerman, which is, what are the most important contaminants left in soil following total structural fires, and how are they mitigated?
Well, I can quickly comment. We ended up taking out about a foot of soil from our vegetable beds based on some of the information that we had. We did not actually test the soil because we already knew there was no doubt that it was toxic.
And I would add to that it heavily depends on the age of the structure. So if a structure is pre-1970s, there is a very high probability that legacy contaminants like lead and asbestos will be present. And in newer construction, you might have different types of synthetic residues that wouldn't be present in older homes. So the next, no, sorry.
I'm sorry. I would just weigh in that there are so many variables. It's very, very difficult. The temperature of the fire, as you said, Mark, the building structure, what's in it, whether there are plastics, what's the nature of the plastics or styrofoam, etc. I think what's important here is that SERI is beginning to explore that, and just capturing the complexity of airborne contaminants during a fire is a huge step forward.
Thank you, Chris. So our next question is, when we're looking at measuring combustion from housing materials and pellets, are we looking at both current and historical building materials? Our current experimental design is focused on current building materials, but given the reality of the age of a lot of buildings throughout the country, that's certainly a direction that we're interested in expanding into. Okay. So I do want to highlight a couple of task forces that are put together by Siri that are focused very specifically on dealing with some of the community health and indoor air quality issues that are downstream of wildfire events. So one of our task forces is on protecting community health, with a focus on how to protect health before, during, and after wildfires. And the other one focuses specifically on indoor air quality issues that are related to WUI and wildfire events. So stay tuned for more information on both of these efforts as they are currently under development. Next slide, please. And we do have quite a few resources available on our Siri website that include fact sheets, videos, guidance documents, technical resources that are specifically related to some of the issues that we've highlighted today associated with dealing with the aftermath of a wildfire. And we would, of course, like to stay in touch via social media. And we would all like to thank you very much